Evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to session 3. Actually, day 3, session 4. The title of today's session is Experiments in Cooperativism, Decentralized Governance and Self-Management. I would like to first introduce the chair today, Errol Sharp, from my own home city in Halifax. We have known each other for several years. Errol is an unusual scholar. He is not an academic in the strict sense. He is a public intellectual, an activist, and a publisher. He publishes. He is in charge of Fernwood Publishing, critical books for critical thinkers. He is a radical thinker, an author of I think more than one books and articles and so on. So welcome, Errol, to chair this session. And just a reminder to the chair, apart from everything else, you are also a timekeeper because we have a tight program. And I would like to introduce our first speaker, Marcelo Vieta, and his paper is on workers' self-management in Argentina, contesting neoliberalism by occupying companies, creating cooperatives, and recuperating autogestion. I hope I pronounced that.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you.
Should I?
And he is in the Department of Leadership, Higher Education, Higher and Adult Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, part of the University of Toronto, not far from where I live. Okay, welcome to the session. And our next speaker, second speaker, is Dario Azzolini. Thank you for joining us and accepting our invitation. And his presentation will be on factory takeovers for production under self-management. 3 examples from Europe. And our third speaker is Sabu Thomas, Vice Chancellor of Mahatma Gandhi University and a world-renowned scientist. And he has a very interesting paper titled Cooperativism to Manage COVID-19. A very interesting paper on cooperativism among scientists who are appropriating or reclaiming the science commons from corporate control. And our next speaker is Joy Elamon, of course, he is here. He is the Director General of the Kerala Institute for Local Administration and obviously an expert on decentralized governance in Kerala. So his paper is titled The Capacity Conundrum, Decentralization and Local Governance, How Kerala Tackles It. And our final speaker, number 5, is Dr. K. Girishan, Associate Professor and Head, Center for Policy and Action Research, RGNIYD, Sri Perumbudur, Tamil Nadu, India. Welcome to you, Girishan. I invite everyone. I invite first the chair to take over today's session. Errol, please take over today's session.
First of all, thank you, Joe, for inviting me to participate in the seminar. It's very interesting, and I am highly honored. The other thing that I want to say is that I am situated in unceded Mi'kmaq territory here in Halifax. My European ancestors stole this land from the Indigenous people, and we have treated them most horribly ever since. And the other thing I wanted to say, I'm the reaction around the world, or particularly in North America around Black Lives Matter, is a phenomenon that's happening that I think is something we can't possibly ignore in any possible way. And the leadership that's now been taken by particularly the National Basketball Association and other sports teams show us the gravity of this situation. And the fact that we can't just sit back and watch it happen. We have to try and see how we can relate to that and do something about it. Maybe we can at least address that somewhere along the line here. So with no further ado, our first speaker this morning is Marcelo Vita. So Marcelo, take it away.
Great, thank you. I'm assuming I can share my screen, yes? There we go, okay. Okay, so I will be presenting on my work that I've been doing for the past 15 years with Argentina's worker recuperated enterprises. I'm going to call them ERTs for short. That's their, the acronym from the Spanish, Empresas Recuperadas por sus Trabajadores. So ERTs emerge from capitalist firms in trouble via workers' own motivations and efforts. Workers in deep conflict on shop floors and with their livelihoods at risk, in the midst of a socioeconomic situation in turmoil or other crisis issues, take over and convert their former employers' businesses to worker cooperatives. My presentation is based on research and theories I develop in my recently published book, Worker Self-Management in Argentina. It's the title of my talk today as well. It is research and theorizing that begins with the voices of the ERT workers, their ideas, their practices, and their creativity. From an oral labor history and political economy approach, the book ultimately develops a social theory of self-management, or what I call autogestión, and I'm reclaiming that Spanish, French, Italian concept, which I'll explain why. My presentation will focus on the possibilities and prefigurations for another economy rooted in worker self-management. I want to acknowledge that there are many difficulties and challenges to these experiences in Argentina and elsewhere, such as entrenched gender-based issues, continuities with explicit and implicit racism, and the focus on formal work versus more broader conceptualization of work. But given the time constraints today, I can't get into these. I want to focus primarily on the prefigurative promises of worker self-management for another economy, especially in our current time, in our current moment of pandemic crisis. I want to quickly say that in my research, I have found that there are three types of conversions of workplaces to cooperatives or worker self-management. The first one is labor conflict conversions, and this is mostly what I'll be talking about. The Argentine ERTs are mostly labor conflict conversions, and they're defensive at first, led by workers that want to save their jobs. Secondly, we can identify negotiated conversions as occurs in Italy, Canada, the US mostly, and these are mostly worker buyouts, owner-led at times they are union-led, or cooperative sector led, and there's some financing and support from the state and some form of legislation that dictates how this process happens. And then partial conversions, ESOPs, worker shareholder co-ops where the workers form a co-op and co-own the firm. So I'll be mostly, in the Argentine case, is mostly the labor conflict conversion type. Also, this labor conflict conversion, Empresa Recuperada, ERT, we can find them in 6 major countries around the world. They're found elsewhere, but primarily in these countries: Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, France, Spain, and Italy. So how did ERTs emerge in Argentina? As the severe form of neoliberalism that had immersed Argentina started to experience a meltdown throughout the 1990s, SME bankruptcies, or small and medium-sized enterprise bankruptcies, mass layoffs, and unemployment rates soared to record levels by the early 2000s. In response, business owners, often in collusion with court trustees, began to engage in nefarious asset stripping schemes to stay afloat or seek to benefit personally from these insolvencies. In this milieu, and with little prospects of finding new jobs, an increasing number of workers from a broad cross-section of Argentina's urban-based economy began taking matters into their own hands. By the early 2000s, more and more threatened workers collectives would occupy the companies and clinics and factories and workshops that had employed them, setting them to work once again. So ERTs are currently found throughout Argentina, throughout the Argentine territory and across its urban sector, and they're still emerging and still within this pandemic situation are still emerging. And I can talk a bit about why they're still emerging and how they are being affected by the current pandemic when we discuss. They're across the national territory, and they're predominantly found, the main sectors are the metallurgical sectors, foodstuffs, printing and graphics, and textiles. This isn't coincidence, since these tend to also be the sectors with the most militant unions in Argentina. And so there are some crossovers between militant unionism, union democracy and shop floor democracy, and workers taking over enterprises. So how did working people in Argentina respond to the neoliberal juggernaut? Starting around 25 years ago, a twofold movement of resistance and renewal brought together Argentina's social justice groups, such as the piqueteros, so these are former unemployed workers that organized and took over streets, the neighborhood assemblies, the barter clubs, myriad community self-provisioning experiments, and the ERTs as well. On the one hand, these were all part of a broader mass movement of protests by rebellious subjects who had had enough of the corruption and capital flight, and frankly, the catatonia of the neoliberal juggernaut that had led to the subsequent sociopolitical crisis that came to a head in 2001 in Argentina. They brought together working and middle-class grievances. On the other hand, it was a massive bottom-up project of conceptualizing and proposing alternative socioeconomic arrangements from below. The big cry felt across Argentina in December 2001 was "Que se vayan todos." Everybody in the political and economic establishment must leave. Implicit in the slogan and in the concept of autogestión was thus this twofold practice of rebellion on the one hand and prefigurative reinvention on the other, which would bring together social movements like the piqueteros and the neighborhood assemblies and the ERTs into something beyond just a politics of demand, but a politics of renovation, renewal, and recuperation of something else, something more basic and more profound for working people. Autogestión would eventually become the other side of this Janus-faced slogan, "Que se vayan todos." In turn, Occupy, Resist, Produce became the slogan that was adopted by many of Argentina's ERTs. That is, occupy the dying firm, often for weeks and months, sleeping with the machines, to resist oppression and repression from returning owners or the state, and ultimately to start production as soon as possible. The unbearable conditions of extreme exploitation on shop floors added to the increasing precarious life conditions. So borrowing from E.P. Thompson, I call this the moral economy of work. It was a moral economy that the most basic rights that are supposedly protected in the labor contract, in the employee-employee contract were violated, compelling more and more workers to engage in the dramatic and often risky action of physically occupying and taking over factories. ERT protagonists would learn these three stages to autogestión collectively, informally, and in the thick of struggles to save their work, or what they told me, sobre la marcha, or on the path of learning, on the path of doing. In the process, they began recuperating the historical Argentine working class tactics of factory occupations. This is not new in Argentina. Over the past century, this has been practiced. Street protests in the 1950s, 1960s, in particular 1970s. And their embrace of autogestión also links to ERT protagonists' social memories of other Argentine working class traditions on shop floors, including a long history of activist unionism, cooperativism, and union-based democratic shop floor organizing. Traditional forms of organizing on shop floors in Argentina have included internal workers' commissions, workers' assemblies, and shop stewards movements. These have been quite strong in Argentina, in particular these, the most militant sectors. The ERT workers' practice of autogestión, this is a term they use, and so this is a term that I've adopted, is developed in praxis. Now, autogestión is improperly, I think, translated in English. It's not, self-management isn't sufficient, I believe. Autogestión has a much more political and much more bottom-up, and it's a much more powerful concept. It comes from the Greek auto, self-same, and the Latin gestio, or to gestate, literally to self-gestate, right? To self-become. A dialectical, materialist, and critical definition of the concept rooted in practice is one of, yes, rebelling against a system that's increasingly exploitative and intensely exploitative, but also one that guides the prefigurative creation of another socioeconomic reality. So autogestión then is a concept that emerges from and further nurtures the twofold practices of rebellion and recreation that eventually seizes the consciousness of ERT workers. And it was defined to me this way, and I think this is the best précis of the term, by an actual worker of the ERT movement. The possibility, autogestión, is the possibility that we all people have to realize ourselves professionally, economically, and in our capacities to labor. It emerges from within ourselves and together with the people with whom we want to share this realization, but without sacrificing personal freedom, without sacrificing personal dignity, and from our own developmental potential. It is, in other words, about the possibility of the full development of the person. In short, autogestión is a desire and lived experience of striving to self-determine a collective's own work and socioeconomic destiny. So ERT workers, it's not perfect. This is obviously not perfect. They work within the capitalist system still. They have to. There's no other choice in Argentina. And they have challenges, and their challenges are multiple. But they're addressing these challenges collectively and in 4 social innovations that I will conclude my talk with. So they're challenged is how to become... Yes, okay. So they're challenged as far as how to become cooperators. These are workers that are 9-to-5 jobs, right? They went to their jobs, they had an owner, they had a boss, and now they have to be cooperators. This is the first major challenge. Restarting production of depleted firms, financial and capitalization challenges in a system, in a banking system, in a credit system that doesn't recognize autonomous self-managed workers, regaining a customer base, unfair competition with other private for-profit capitalist firms that don't have to take on the social dimensions that ERTs do. Inappropriate bankruptcy in labor and cooperative legislation. But the ERT movement has self-organized, formed umbrella organizations, and lobbied the state and created not only new workplaces, but actually influenced the reform and transformation of Argentine law, right? So, for example, the use of expropriation, which is guaranteed in the Argentine Constitution. The state can expropriate property that's of benefit to the public, and so these firms are expropriated, some of them by the state, and then ceded to workers, and lobbying to reform Argentina's bankruptcy law as well to privilege workers that want to take over a firm and run a firm. Self-managed workers, a firm that's in crisis. And now with the new left-leaning government of Alberto Fernandez, the ERT workers are in essence in government, which we can critique this, but they are present in the Ministry of Social Production and the Ministry of Labor, and they've started a new coalition or commission for registering ERTs in Argentina and further recognizing them and mapping their current situation. And they're currently also lobbying for a new law of recuperation of productive entities in Argentina. And in my final comments, I want to talk about 4 radical social innovations that ERTs promise in Argentina. Social innovations are novel solutions to social problems that are more effective, efficient, and sustainable than those offered, frankly, by capitalism. And I call them radical because ERTs, by encompassing these social innovations, both critique the neoliberal capitalist system and also offer solutions and possibilities to reorganizing work and production. So the first radical social innovation is social and solidarity economic practices as collective responses to continuing crises and struggles and threats. So for example, ERTs organizing in networks of similar-minded cooperatives or similarly focused cooperatives. One is the graphics network is one that comes to mind. So taking on production collectively. Another example is the refuse in the production of one ERT becomes the production input to another ERT, right? This happens across Argentina, supporting other social movements and social struggles, working class struggles and social movement struggles as well. And when one ERT is threatened, other ERTs come. And I can mention many more, but that's acting in a social and solidarity way that acts beyond the competitive market. The second social innovation is more economically and socially just workplaces. So for example, practicing democratic decision-making across the firm, conducting regular workers' assemblies, much more so than the required one assembly per year for a cooperative in Argentina that's legislated by law, and equitable pay schemes despite the skill level. So around 70% of ERTs practice this. Also contesting the notion of efficiency, growth, and work itself, right? What does it mean to work on a day-to-day basis by, for example, incorporating into their labor process breaks throughout the day. For example, in Argentina, there's the tradition of drinking the mate, which is this bitter tea that's drunk out of a gourd. And there's a picture on the bottom left-hand side of a mate station right in the middle of one of the ERTs that I visited. This is common across Argentina, across the ERTs, and this is where they come together, they talk about strategy, and they talk about production as well. So it's another way of collectively looking at production that reclaims and recuperates Argentine working class culture. The third social innovation is bringing the community into the workplace. Many of these workplaces, to give back to the communities that supported them over the years, open up the shop that's not being used for production or the shop during non-production time to community centers, to free health clinics in depleted neighborhoods, to K-12 adult or K-12 and adult popular education initiatives that are themselves cooperatives and that work with marginalized communities in the neighborhood. And fourthly, extending the workplace out into the community. So the third social innovation brings the community into the workplace, and now the workplace is extended out into the community by sharing parts of their surpluses with local community development. And this is, we see this across the most radical, let's say, ERTs in Argentina. I could tell you many stories about this, but time does not permit me, but perhaps during the discussion period we can get into. This kind of tears apart and kind of tears open the capitalist secret that's present in a traditional capitalist enterprise, right? And all of a sudden now the enterprise is opened up and the community is allowed in. So that secret that the competitive firm retains for itself is torn asunder, right, in this process. In Argentina, the ERT workers call this La Fábrica Abierta, or the open factory. And I want to just end by saying what exactly is recuperated by workers that take over factories. It's much more than just a building or machinery. I've developed these 7 kind of recuperations, what I call recuperative moments, from an inverse reading of Marx's Capital. That is, workers, by taking over their work and workplaces, actually take back control over and decommodify labor power. They take back control over their surpluses. They reclaim the control over their associated labor and work in voluntary corruption. The labor process, the division of labor, and the social production of social wealth is also taken back. And finally, and most importantly, workers' dignity, which was lost.
I sent a message, some questions to this speaker, to you.
In the capitalist form
Yeah,
report.
put it there.
I'm going to end there. I hope I haven't gone over my time, but thank you so much for inviting me, and I look forward to the other presentations.
Thank you, Marcelo. Without any further ado, I'll call on Dario Assini, who will be, I don't need to repeat what Joe said, so Dario, if you will just step in here and go ahead.
Hey, you're on mute, Dario.
You're on mute.
Hey, Dario, you're on mute, man.
All right. Okay. First of all,
There you
I'm thankful, very thankful for the presentation that Marcelo did, because it makes it easier for me, and I have to explain less things than I thought I would have to. See. Okay. So I will do a presentation of 3 case studies. I've been also studying about like almost 20 years different recuperated workplaces. We're co-authoring a book, Marcelo and I, on generally worldwide on that. I've been doing research primarily in Venezuela, and then also in Argentina and Uruguay, and in different European countries, France, Greece, Italy, and Serbia and Croatia, and published a few books. One is also one edited book. You can get it also in India through Akar Press, Akar Publishing, I think. And others you'll find on my website, which is down there. So, okay, just to add something to the vision that Marcelo presented. What numbers are we talking about? Okay, worldwide, Argentina more than 400 with more than 15,000 workers. In Venezuela, approximately 100. In Brazil's at least 78. In Uruguay at 22, and at least 1 to 3 companies, if maintain strict criteria that also Marcelo presented, in countries like Italy, France, Greece, Bosnia, Croatia, Tunisia, Egypt, in India, in the US, and Turkey, and in other countries. One of the general problems is that, and that question came up, usually they're not really, I mean, you have a few unions in Argentina supporting them, but usually no one is really interested in making them public. Obviously not the capitalists, obviously not the bourgeois press, but often not even the parties or the unions, because it takes away the need of agency of the unions and of parties. I mean, these are workers self-organizing, and they show that a different way than the established way and the institutional ways are possible. Often these, like Marcelo said, often these occupied workplaces, they don't occupy like before in history before. I mean, this occupation existed like during the last 150 years. Workers have taken over factories and their workplaces, but now it's a defensive situation. So it's not an offensive situation like in the revolutionary offensive or whatever, but a defensive situation. It means that they often stick to their like local radios or regional. They don't get very known. And in many countries, like there's a systematic research exists only in Argentina and Venezuela, a bit in Brazil, but even Brazil is so big that the researchers don't have the money to travel the whole country to see if a workplace occupation that happens has certain goals or not, or is structured in a certain way or not. And the same thing happens even like in all European countries where there's no systematic research at all. I know of cases in Italy. There's one down there in the corner, for example, like Messina. It used to be a brewery, Heineken brewery, and it was then closed. And then the workers organized a crowdfunding to buy it and makes the city cooperative beer. I haven't been there. I cannot say how they're really functioning and structuring, if there are an egalitarian cooperative or not, which are obviously things that would be important to find out. Okay, the 3 cases I'm talking about are in France, Greece, and Italy, very different situations. And you might also think, okay, Europe, what does it have to do with India or with any other place? Well, my experience is that yes, you have different circumstances, and the most advanced and the best are probably even in Argentina, not even in Europe. But once workers lose their jobs in a situation of crisis, and especially if they're older, it doesn't make a big difference if they are in Argentina or in Greece or in Italy. It might make a difference if they're in Denmark or in Germany, but not if they're in Southern Europe And the situation is the same. They have no hope to find a new job. They have little alternatives and little support by the state or by other institutions. Okay, let's start. Scop Tea is a tea packing factory, formerly Lipton Unilever. They were packing tea and different herbal infusions. In September 2010, Unilever decides to relocate the whole production to Poland and machines. It's a 125-year-old plant. They simply decide to dismantle it and transfer everything because it's cheaper to Poland. All the workers, 182, occupy and get support from the Communist Union, Confédération Générale du Travail. After 3 years, the occupation lasts 3 years, more than 3 years, still 76 are still active. That shows also what the workers have to put in sometimes to be able to resist and to continue. Because it means like 3 years of struggles, of uncertainty, the situations where your family asks you, what are you doing? And what is this good for? And etc. They asked from the beginning for the plants and the machine, and they even asked for the brand, which they didn't get, but they got everything else. So what happened? In May 2014, the Unilever and the workers reached an agreement, and Unilever agreed to pay to them 20 million euros, which is approximately 22 million, even more than 22 million dollars, 23 million dollars right now, to the 136 workers that were formerly, like at that moment, workers of the factory. 7 million in machines and facilities. In May 2015, the ex-Forlib reopened its Scop Tea, which is the cooperative society of the Provençal, it's the region, workers for tea and infusions. And the brand name, they have two brands. One is organic tea and the other one is naturally flavored teas and infusions. And the one for the naturally flavored, the bigger one, is called 1336, which is the number of days the worker struggle lasted. So it's interesting how they keep up their pride and their situation. The struggle. The production, they produce now 30 different organic and natural aroma teas, herbal and fruit infusions, organic black and green tea from India and China. They're working together, trying to get international certification for some cooperatives in Vietnam and in India to then deal directly with them and buy the tea from them, and locally with local producers of herbs and spices and etc. The necessary, this is to give you the dimensions, necessary turnaround is 4 million euros a year, and it was almost achieved in 2019. The 42 workers, there are 42 stable workers now. Many then retired, etc., or found something else. But 42 workers are earning 1,600 to 1,700 a month, and the director 2,000, which shows that's established by the unions. The director cannot earn less than 2,000, and the others, it depends on what the family situation is, but it's almost an egalitarian income. So second example, and we see modern factory, modern machinery, high turnaround. They kept all the machinery because they occupied immediately when the factory was left by the owner. And then second example, Rimaflow. Maflow was a transnational car producer, air conditioning pipes, and closed in 2009 because of fraudulent bankruptcy. The workers occupied the plant, pressured first in 2010, a new investor bought it, but the investor sold it again in 2012 without ever opening, simply because he wanted the name. Because in car parts, Maflow is a big name in the whole world. So the Polish investor just wanted the name, and that's why he kept the factory for 2 years and then closed it when it was legal by law, because he was supposed, obviously, to restart it. In February 2013, 20 former Maflow workers, together with other workers from other factories that had been fired, occupied the plant with others. The plant was empty. The owner had taken out all the machines. The workers had waited too much until to occupy. But the other problem was also simply that they produced, like, who's going to buy air-conditioned pipes? They were selling them to BMW. BMW is not going to buy air-conditioned pipes from a workers-occupied factory, obviously. So they didn't even have the possibility to continue with the production. And that's also a problem that comes up with some of the factories. And they reinvented themselves with a new production mix. Recycling and upcycling of computers and white goods. They set up a cafeteria where workers from all the industrial areas were going to have lunch during work times, cultural activities, networks with organic farmer co-ops. They started producing organic tomato sauce. They started an organic liquor production in cooperation with different political projects. So they started like with an association for partisan studies. They started a partisan bitter, a vodka Kollontai together with an LGBT association, so that a part of the money of the income revenues goes also to these associations. And they started then industrial pellets recycling. So they were picking up old broken pellets from other factories, putting them together again, and then reselling them. The recycled products are distributed on a local level, food and liquor, and mainly in solidarity economy networks. They have now, the co-op itself has 17 full-time workers paid 800 to 900 after tax a month. A worker's salary in Italy is far lower than it is in France. It's around 1,300 euros. And moreover, there are like 70 independent workers with their offices and workshops. The owners, which were then at a certain point the bank, UniCredit, tried several times to evict them. The last time in November 2018, but it failed because of the big solidarity of hundreds of other workers coming and defending the factory. So they decided, okay, they got to this agreement and said, okay, we're going to give you 300,000 euros and until April 2019 to find a new space. Mimaflow workers set up a consortium of social economy companies, got more money, more loans, and bought a factory with 9,000 square meters just around the corner, just the same industrial area, and moved there, relocated there. That's the new factory you see on the pictures in May 2019. And the idea is to create a total of 331 workplaces, which would be exactly one more than Maflow had in its best times. So third example, Viome, Thessaloniki, Greece, industrial glue production, insulin and other chemical building materials. The owners gave up the factory in 2011, even if it was still making profits, but they transferred it to the mother firm, all the profits, and gave credits that the mother firm couldn't pay back. And it started like a fraudulent bankruptcy, as so often. They left 70 unpaid workers behind, and a lot of them, that it was also a long, and it's an ongoing struggle. They have not solved their situation, their legal situation. In July 2011, the workers occupied the plant. First, they just wanted like their money. We organized the two workers from our Argentinian factory, who bought them tickets. We raised money to buy them tickets, and they went to Greece and discussed a few days with the workers. And after that, the workers in Greece decided, discussing workers to workers, that, okay, we're going to not just ask for money, we're going to ask for the whole factory and stay here and restart production. They restarted production in February 2013, producing organic laundry soap, liquid and powder, and organic hand and body soap based on olive oil. Meanwhile, they're also producing different house cleaning products, all like organic. The Solidarity Clinic in Thessaloniki moved into the one empty factory hall in 2015. This is like in the crisis, they started up setting up more than 40 autonomous clinics in Greece that are self-operated, self-sustained, because like parts of the healthcare system broke down. The Viome workers did also very many solidarity initiatives. During the huge refugee crisis on the border, they bought a minivan and drove up once a week the 57 miles to the border to support stranded refugees, because they said their logic was they are workers like we are, so they need our support. So Viome has now 24 full-time stable workers. They earn approximately 500 euros a month after tax. Unemployment in Greece is 360 to 460 euros, so they earn more than unemployment. And unfortunately, like not much less than a worker's salary is often in Greece after the crisis. The products are much cheaper than comparable organic products. The production is distributed also through networks of solidarity economy and local street markets, and they opened up an own store in 2017. They resisted up to now every attempt to be auctioned, to be sold, to be dismantled, etc. So what are the common characteristics? Marcelo described a few of them. So transformation of a hierarchically structured capitalist business into a democratically self-managed company with the workers being at its center. Almost everything changes, like Marcelo described, the workers' subjectivity, social relations among the workers, the labor process, internal dynamics, and the relationships with providers, customers, and communities. So look at the internal structures, ownership. Okay, the means of production are transformed from individual property into collective property and social ownership. It means no individual property, no individual shares. You don't have any property that you can keep if you leave the factory or sell it. You are only owner in a collective way as long as you are part of the factory worker, or maybe even retired, because some of them have also retiring schemes. So the decision-making is collective also. There's a shop floor democracy, which is a huge difference to many traditional cooperatives. And they also often try to achieve consensual decisions. Equity of income. Bonuses are often according to the family situation. So what are the external relationships? One of the most important things to understand, and I try to explain also always to my students, to other people, the most important thing to win is transform the legal question, so the closure of the company and dismissal of the workers, into a political question, because that's where the workers can win. They can barely win staying only on the legal ground. They can make the process longer, so they always have to fight on a legal ground. Skopje, for example, managed to abolish the social plans and the dismissals of the factory of Unilever during 2 years. So they had to continue to pay them, and then they had to struggle again in courts to get the payment. But you have to transform the legal question into a political question. The struggle is this is coming to the end soon. The three main pillars are production, mobilization, and legal struggle. In all examples, I have seen that are successful for a time, or at least, or even in the end. So they have an autonomy. They insist on the autonomy regarding discussions and decisions, which is very different from autarky. Look out. Interaction with the state. They need an interaction with the state. So it's not like the highest revolutionary moment that you don't have anything to do, but you need, at some point, you need the institutions at least to ignore you so that you don't get evicted. And in a better case, to influence laws or to have stop evictions, etc., etc. They all favor relationships with other occupied workplaces, cooperatives, solidarity economy, etc. Also, the capitalist market might be more important because they have to operate on it, most of them, mainly. They maintain contact with social movements, political and social organizations, and participate in regional, national, and global networks. Marcelo described with the example of Argentina how they do it, but most, even in Europe, do it more or less the same way, and also in other places. Also the community integration, etc. There is a difference in unions, how they react. Most don't have, but some have support, etc., even if the unions are not officially promoting this. But like in France, it's where they have the major support. In Italy, it's some smaller unions. In Greece, not even the communist unions supports workplace recuperations. There's a difference in local institutions also, differences between a completely neoliberal thinking in Italy, or in France, a strong culture of national production. In Greece, not even the leftist government supported them. What is a common characteristic is ecological concerns and questions of sustainability become central to the workers. The production changes often to organic products. The suppliers are mainly local and regional. Recycling becomes important. and to connect the ecological concerns with a class perspective. So to keep consumer prices low, even if you produce in certain niche sectors or organic stuff. And the suppliers are preferably cooperatives. So to resume, and Marcelo mentioned a few of these points, they are offensive struggle in the context of unionized labor, when unionized labor struggles are almost always defensive struggles. So out of a defensive situation, they develop an offensive struggle, which is obviously an important class issue and class perspective. They have managed to survive in a hostile environment. They can preserve jobs and production. They strengthen local and regional economies, and they're obviously not a temporal phenomena. They bring together all workers on the shop floor, not just the ones that might share similar opinions and build a cooperative. The fact that there is a long struggle strengthens the social relationships and reduces later conflicts, which in cooperatives are often around questions like how long did you work enough to get the same money, etc. That does not happen if you have had the experience of like 2 years, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years of putting your bodies together on the line and have to trust the others when maybe the police is attacking you, or you go to demonstrations, or you do not have enough to feed your family. So there is a completely different relationship of trust that comes up. They dissolve the former hierarchies, because when it doesn't matter what kind of job you had, when you suddenly have to organize the resistance, and obviously they're very unlikely to reinstall them later on. And last, also the solidarity relationships, they reinforce class consciousness, because it's not, it is clear that it's a question of workers against capital during the struggle. And as Marcelo also mentioned, the appropriation of the means of production, the way it happens, questions questions ownership, questions the capitalist system, even if they have to operate in it. So it is a different thing from many cooperatives, especially in Europe and North America, where like cooperatives have become, in most cases, a synonym of just an alternative business structure, but are still based on the same concept as capitalist private firms, with like the individual property gives you the right to decide and to make decisions, which is, I think, a huge problem. Okay, so thank you very much.
Very much. We're going to have to move on here a little faster. Joe had asked me to try and keep you to 15 minutes. Now, I don't know how to intervene on this machine, except to yell my head off. So you'll have to try your own self-discipline. I'd like to call on Sabu Thomas, who will be speaking to us on cooperativism to manage COVID-19.
Thank you, Errol, for your kind introduction. Thanks to Joe. The title of my talk is Cooperativism to Manage COVID-19. I wanted to show you a global picture. If you look at the confirmed cases of coronavirus, is 22 million people all over the world. And if you look at the number of deaths, 782,000 deaths actually the whole world. And again, if you look at the WHO statistics in Americas, if you look at the confirmed coronavirus patients, more than 12 million. In Europe, 3 million people. In Southeast Asia, 3 million. East Mediterranean, 1.7 million. Africa, 975,000. Western Pacific, 435,000. Just to give you a picture about the effect of global pandemic. Again, if you look at the number of people died, you can see in America, the total American continent, you can see 430,000 deaths. Europe, 215. Southeast Asia, 65,000. Africa, 19,000. And again, if you look at the country-wise, the biggest casualty was the United States. You can see the number of confirmed cases is 5 million. And followed by Brazil, the number of confirmed infected cases, 3 million. India stands 2 million, more than 2 million, going to be 3 million now. Russia, 940 to 100 people, followed by South Africa and Peru. Look at the number of people died. United States, the topper, 172,000 people, even still more than that. Followed by Brazil, Mexico, India, United Kingdom, and Italy. And you can see the curve. India, still the curve is not flattened. I wanted to talk to you about the cooperative movement to contain COVID-19. International cooperation amplifies individual countries' efforts to fight against COVID-19 pandemic. International cooperation is, I would say, is extremely useful, almost indispensable to contain the COVID-19. And there are a lot of coordinated policies across the globe. I'm going to look at these policies one by one very briefly. I wanted to tell you that, if you look at the cooperation for crisis response, one of the first points I want to tell you is scaling up of medical capacity for tracing, testing, and treating. If you look at the Korean model, what they did, the triple T model, trace, test, and treat. If you want to do that, you need to have lots of health professionals. You need to have ventilators. We need to have, the kits to test, the kit to test the, COVID patients. So this is very important. The scaling up of medical capacity for, finding the people, tracing the people, testing and treating is extremely important. And second area of cooperation is, I also want to tell you that there's a very interesting figure. If you look at this, if you look at this picture, you can see there are a lot of restrictions in importing and exporting in many countries. If you look at India, if you look at the measure in January, there were a lot of restriction in importing and exporting, but it is lifted. And if you look at February, you can see there are a lot of restrictions in China. But if you look at in March, in the month of March 2020, the restrictions have been sort of completely relaxed. Look at the present situation. You don't see much of restrictions. So it's very important that many countries have lifted the restrictions so that people could actually import or export things. The doctors could travel around. Medical equipments could be sent to other countries. So this was a very good sign of cooperativism. Second point I wanted to tell you is effective vaccine development and deployment. Again, if you look at the WHO statistics, there are 181 candidates, 181 vaccines in different parts of the world being developed. And to develop vaccine, we need to have a lot of cooperation. We need money. Again, if you critically analyze the data, there are a lot of funding raised during the COVID time. A lot of funding came from European Union, a lot of funding in Japan, a lot of funding in the United States to find a good vaccine for COVID. And a lot of cooperation you can see for vaccine development. Third point is continued surveillance to detect re-emergence of the virus. This is an again important point. Many countries, the virus is actually coming again. So in order to prevent this, we need information to be continuously propagated, rapidly propagated, widely propagated, freely shared across the borders. This is extremely important. So WHO says all the information should be continuously, rapidly, widely, freely shared across the borders. Otherwise, you cannot have very good control measures to detect the re-emergence of the virus. The fourth point I wanted to tell you is continuous and strong support for least developed countries. If you look at the least developed countries, the health systems are vulnerable and underfunded. About 90% of low-income countries are facing health worker shortages. And many least developed countries suffer from, health crisis. And so there, we need to have really good support for the least developed countries as well as developing countries. The next point is fiscal policy measures. Countries have individually implemented significant fiscal measures. There also, we need to have inclusive and sustainable fiscal measures on a global point of view. This is another important point. Fiscal policy measures on a global point of view. The next important point is monetary policy. An important act of cooperation has been the establishment of swap lines between major central banks. I can show you some data. If you look at the central bank, support, there are lots of initiative for supporting COVID-19 pandemic. If you look at the European Central Bank, from March onwards, there's a substantial increase in the funding in the European Central Bank. Look at this. This is in March 2020. There's a substantial increase in the funding in European Central Bank. Look at the Bank of Japan. Again, you can see a lot of funding for the COVID pandemic. And if you look at the Bank of England, you can see a substantial increase in the funding. So if you look at all banks together, you can see a beautiful statistical data. So there are a lot of, Federal Reserve dramatically enhances the support for COVID-19. Trade policy and supply chains. As I mentioned earlier, we need to have liberal trade policies, import and export policies, and supply chain should be extremely active. In short, I wanted to tell you that there should be very active cooperation to reverse protectionist practices, to reverse protectionist policies, resist implementing further barriers, and strengthen the robustness and resilience of supply chains. Otherwise, many countries are not able to get, PPTs, PPEs, ventilators, drugs, vaccines, etc., etc. This is extremely important. The 8th point is improve preparedness for future pandemic and risk. Enhance efforts to address global shortage of health workers through initiatives such as International Labour Organization, Organization of Economic and Cooperative Development, and the WHO working for increased preparedness for future pandemic and risk. This is again an important point we have to learn. I also wanted to point a few more issues. COVID-19 pandemic, a wake-up call for better cooperation at the science policy society interface. I wanted to make a few points on this. The first point is we have to strengthen national capacities for science-based decision-making across all countries. This is one of the lessons we learned from COVID. 5 lessons for science policy and society. Strengthen national capacities for science-based decision-making in all countries. Second point is enhance public trust in science. Very, very important. Public trust in science. The third point is share knowledge and data to promote collaborative research. The fourth important point is ensure universal access to solutions. Fifth point is act with a greater urgency on global scientific assessments. I also wanted to show you some data. As a result of increased cooperative movement, look at the publications in Wuhan. If you look at the publications in Wuhan city, pre-COVID-19, you can see this figure. And if you look at the blue line, after COVID, the COVID-19, you see the publications have been enhanced dramatically. And it has been found that Wuhan publications are jointly published, with the US and many universities. And if you look at the Hangshan University of Science and Technology, look at the pre-COVID situation and COVID-19 situation, lots of publications have come out. University of Hong Kong, look at the pre-COVID situation and look at the COVID situation, lots of papers. Fudan University in China, look at the pre-COVID situation and a COVID situation. So all around the world, there are a lot of increased publications on scientific journals to understand the corona well. And if you look at the funding, global funding for COVID research, if you look at the National Institute of Health, the percent of funded articles, the funding for research, this is for 16.9% for before pre-COVID. That means 2019 January to 2019 December, 16.9%. If you look at 6 months data from NIH, NIH has 12.2%. And if you look at the Chinese situation, National Science Foundation of China, look at 14.3% pre-COVID. And COVID-19, 28%. So there is substantial increase in funding for international cooperative research. I also wanted to show you another important slide. There are a lot of funding for testing, there are a lot of funding for treating, there are a lot of funding for preventing COVID-19. So developing new tools in response to COVID-19. And if you look at Indian situation, we had a big call from India-US virtual network for COVID-19. This was a joint proposal. There was a BRIC proposal. BRIC means, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's a big call for, BRICS to tackle COVID-19. Look at Sastri COVID-19 pandemic response grants. We applied for all these grants during the COVID time, and we are waiting for the results. There is another important call still open. COVID joint research proposal, Southeast Asia, Europe. This is open till I think till October. Probably this is open. You can see the 15th October is the last day. There's a lot of funding proposals invited. They're all international funding proposals. And how soon will a vaccine be ready? I also wanted to show you some interesting data on vaccine. If you look at a typical vaccine preparation, you see, normally a vaccine takes 5 years. Look at small scale production, manufacturing scale-up, large scale manufacturing process, preclinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and licensing. So it takes actually a lot of time. And if you look at the COVID-19, we have to really, do it within 18 months. So there are a lot of international cooperation for COVID-19. You can see industry cooperate with academia. There are a lot of partnership. You can see our own laboratory in India. This the laboratory in Pune. They are cooperating with Oxford to finding out a vaccine for COVID. Russia is worked extremely hard, and they have come out with a COVID vaccine. And Germany, I also wanted to tell you that Germany actually supported global COVID-19 response. Germany provided 17 million euro to WHO to support the COVID issues. And you can also see that Germany and Switzerland actually treated COVID patients. They actually, airlifted COVID patients from Italy, France, and Spain to Germany and Switzerland, and treated them. And they also provided ventilators and a lot of support to other countries. And if you look at the Iranian situation, there was a massive cooperative movement to make masks and sanitizers and masks, PPE. This is the situation in Iran. Action measures in Iran, cooperative movements. These are all Iranian cooperative movements within the country. You can see the cooperative movement in Iran for giving, support to the poor people. There's another interesting thing. MIT-based team workers developed a sort of low-cost ventilator, and this was free. Some of the Indian engineers, what they did? They took up this design and they manufactured low-cost ventilator in India, because the MIT team invented something new, and this was actually, they didn't patent it. Therefore, the Indian young engineers could take it up and make it in a bigger scale and make it much cheaper. And this was available in India. This is a very nice example of cooperation. And my own group, what we did, we cooperated with the Georgia Institute of Technology, and we submitted a major proposal under India-US program supported by NSF and DST of India. There were 7 groups designing a new mask for COVID. This is our new mask we have designed. Recently we we submitted this proposal for a major funding. You can see this is the outer layer, this is a middle layer, and this is the inner layer. To conclude my lecture, without international cooperation, both the exit from the crisis and the recovery are likely to be slow and weak. That is number 1. And effective disease surveillance, swift vaccine development, and preparedness for future epidemics all should be benefited from cooperative action. Preserving trade openness and increasing the robustness and resiliency of resilience of supply chains can not only ensure countries' access to vital medical goods, but also stimulate post-pandemic economy. Finally, I wanted to tell you that internationally coordinated cooperative fiscal and monetary policies are extremely important to support least developed countries. So I thank you very much for your patient hearing. I also wanted to quote some of the, famous quote of UNESCO Director General: virus, no boundaries. Virus, no boundaries. International cooperation is the only way forward. Look at the sentences of Jeong from Korea. Korea is actually one of the best countries they could tackle the corona. In the research for the vaccine and in therapies, sharing research data and output and collaboration between scientists are crucial. Look at the quote from the WHO, Soumya Swaminathan: science must be allowed to lead the global response to this pandemic. And finally, I wanted to quote the UN Secretary General's sentence: we are in this together and we will get through this together. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to move on quickly to our next session, Capacity Conundrum, Decentralization of Local Governments, how Kerala tackled it, by Joy Elman.
Thank you, Errol. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. I have actually been part of this webinar for the last 3 days. I heard Dr. Isaac talking about the context in which the People's Plan campaign started, how it was trying to make the governments closer to the people, deepening and widening democracy. Then we heard Patrick Heller talking about the changes happening across the globe, especially on decentralization governance. Professor Ole Törnqvist mentioned about Sweden's experiences and Sweden's status at the moment, but he gave a clear warning to and also advice to Kerala, especially about decentralization and local governance. And Steve Friedman from South Africa actually talked about the South African catastrophe with regard to decentralization and local governance. And Dr. Harilal from Kerala mentioned about what we do now, how we are going forward, but no need of a kind of a romanticization of local governance. And Dr. Sanal Mohan talked about the value system, the exclusion, the social citizenship, all implying or in relation to local governance. So what I wanted to talk was about the capacity development. When we are all talking about this, and in many countries where the local governance and decentralization started in the same period of the late 80s and the 90s, but how it deteriorated or collapsed, whereas how Kerala is still moving ahead and why. And where I think we also managed to do something with the capacities. Hope you can see this. Okay. And so when we started in 1996, we all heard about the preconditions for decentralization. We need the legislations, the rules, guidelines, human resources in place, the capacity to be developed, and then only we can actually do with decentralization, start decentralization. But what we tried was a big bang approach of fiscal devolution, a campaign and a pressure, and thought the campaign would actually create pressure from below. And so it was a People's Plan campaign where we actually had the scientific, participatory, and time-bound plan preparation, bringing together officials, experts, volunteers, and mass of people with elected representatives. Especially Ole actually talked about the need for working with others. So that was an experiment. And I would actually say that capacity building was the key to the People's Plan campaign. Every stage of People's Plan campaign was focused on capacity building. And capacity is about building core competencies and capacity gaps to enabled them to function as local governments, I would say. But then the question was always whether you are building capacities or developing capacities. Building means you're actually starting from the scratch, from the ground, whereas development is building on from something already there. I would say we tried both because the situation was that in certain cases it was really building, whereas most of the other cases it was developing from what was already there. And the components of capacities, it's not just training, it's an institutional development, the finance resource development, human resources development, and supportive programs from the state. And we have to also think about what capacities. It is not just orientation and trainings. It's about building, developing knowledge, skills, attitude, systems, and change, and how to plan. And above all, we all have to build this, develop this on the politics of decentralization and local governance. That exactly what Professor Tonkis mentioned, or even Friedman mentioned, what happened in South Africa, for example. The politics of decentralization and local governance need to be addressed. And whose capacity? In a local governance system, we need to have a lot of actors there, various levels, national, state, and local governments, because it's not just building the capacities at the local level alone. When you are talking about local governance, we need to develop the capacities of higher tiers also, higher levels also, because they also have to contribute in strengthening local governance and decentralization. So it's a large group of people, I would say millions of people. But I would say, though we all called it the Big Bang approach in Kerala, I don't think it was done like that. We have a legacy history of from untouchability to participatory planning. There were the reform movements in Kerala, the land reforms, the ideological positions on local governance, the education, the literacy movement, participatory resource mapping, and the Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad, the KSSP experiments and citizen education, and of course, various activities and interventions by the NGOs and CBOs, and of course, learning from the international experiences. So it was not just like that. And actually, why I'm mentioning all these things is because why Kerala is still moving ahead with the decentralization local governance is because these were all set in place with a solid, strong foundation, and we are still taking it forward. So we had the 3 stages of capacity development, starting with the campaign. See, it was, as I said, the People's Plan campaign was not just about planning. It was about a high and massive, large scale training process. We had the phase-wise process, the cascading kind of trainings with various kinds of people. And then the sector-wise various subjects and themes, handbooks, institutional training. With decentralized training system, we are talking about millions of people getting oriented or trained, because it's not about one place or other things. The entire province or the state is doing local level planning, and also learning from each other, from one local government to the other kind of trainings also. So it was a massive exercise of capacity building through training. And the pedagogy varies. We are talking about adult learning, the toolkits, the handbooks, good practices need to be conveyed to others, and all kinds of things. But then from there, the campaign, yesterday we were all talking about, especially Dr. Harlan and all were talking about, campaign is one part, but we need to move ahead. We can't depend on campaign forever. So there's a transition happening. That is where my institute, where I am working now, steps in. From a campaign point of action to the Kerala Institute of Local Administration stepping in. It laid the foundations to become a center of excellence, developed a capacity development strategy. That's why I'm saying it's for the future. Analysis of the decentralized administrative system, because capacity also includes the systems to be in place, the institutional trainings, decentralized training system. We are talking about large number of people, mobile field teams who requires hand-holding. Basically, we had to cover from the campaign group. But in the meantime, we also had a initiative called Capacity Development for Decentralization in Kerala, the CAPDEC, where we also had local initiatives, especially yesterday and day before yesterday, people were talking about things have to happen from below. The state monitored and state led alone won't work. Exactly that. We also had various examples of moving from below with the local governments, the panchayats, the municipalities coming up with new things, different regions. And then, so there is a training from top, experiences from the grassroots, and as an intermediate platforms as an interface where Kila acts the key nodal role. So like that, we had strengthening of village assemblies by many panchayats, how the CBOs, community-based organization, works with the panchayats, the local governments, mainstreaming gender, empowering the marginalized. Some of the local governments prepared their own management system, manuals for each sector and institution, tools for citizens charter, grievance redressal, social audit, women's status study, and later gender status study, gender planning, budgeting, vigilance committees, and many such initiatives happened from the local. And for example, child-friendly initiatives, child-friendly local governance, elderly-friendly local governance. Many things happen from below, and then it gets mainstreamed, and the government takes over and announces it for the entire place. So it is, as I said, from top as well as from down, and then the platform. So that is how we move to the institutionalization, the third phase. As I said, Kila evolved as a center of excellence, training system in place. We also moved from training to real capacity development with new thematic areas coming in, SDGs, the climate change, the disaster management, gender, environment, IT systems, geoinformatics, social justice, urban issues, and also facilities of space for innovation and incubation by local governance, which we provide. So this is how the institutionalization actually takes place in capacity building, not training alone. But one other important thing which happened during this time is about the local government associations. See, that is again the pressure from below, or pressure from horizontal pressure actually coming in, so that the system remains intact or moves forward. In many places, when it collapsed, I think one of the major contribution was from the local government associations, where they were made a vibrant body for advocacy and action. And they have the documentation, they have seminars and workshops, and engages regularly with the state government and even the central government. So that is how the pressure is still there. And of course, we also have a system called the institution called the Local Government Commission. Actually, they conduct studies and they go through this and advise us on new things. And of course, the constitutional bodies like the State Finance Commission and others. So what I'm trying to say is that why Kerala is still going ahead with or forward with these things, that it is because of a great foundation laid down on capacity building, focusing on capacity building. But initially I mentioned only about the 3 stages: campaign, the transition, and the institutionalization. But then phase 4 is about, we are moving into the new era of local governments. I would say post-COVID or recent situations, I would say. See, of course, we faced ups and downs. People's Plan campaign, when it started, it had general consensus, but there were ideological issues, there were practical issues. Then there was a second wave of ideological and political questions asked, which actually affected us. And then the institutionalization itself sometimes gets trivialized, and then the stagnation. The capacity challenges still, but it's not just about training, it's about political will and clarity, bureaucracy, professionals versus elected representatives, information and data gap, lack of support systems, vertical and donor programs, which affects the local governance and decentralization process in many ways. And we are actually thinking about multi-level planning and not decentralized planning. It is multi-level planning, which Dr. Harilal yesterday mentioned. And there the integration issues, convergence issues come in. And then the state plan versus the local government plan. We have a provincial plan or a state government plan, and how the local government plan actually matches or integrates. We had mentioned about the district plan, but moving on from district plan, and we have not considered the spatial dimensions in planning. We have not considered the data-based planning. Still, we can go by the annual plans. We are not thinking on a long-term plan. And even how does one plan itself always becomes a problem once in a while. And plan versus budget and implementation is another capacity challenge. Issues of own resource mobilization, mainly dependent on state provisions and central provisions. And we in Kerala faces a lot of second generation issues, unlike other states in India, and decreasing space for community ownership and weekend village assemblies. That was the participatory forum which you are expecting, and decreasing participation and lack of in-depth independent studies to guide us. That is again another capacity issue, I would actually say. But then the another point which I wanted to mention in the new era is about own initiatives in many areas by local governments. They have actually moved so far ahead. Many of them have moved far ahead beyond what Kila or the training institutions provide. They come up with their own ideas in various sectors. We have a weekly Saturday program on webinar on how they function. Especially that we had the massive floods in 2018 where local governments plunged in, and that actually showed us what capacities they have. And this actually led government to think that the disaster management has to be done by the local governments at the local level. So this is how they influenced policy. They showed that we have the capacity. And in Wuhan, when they had the first case of COVID, our local governments were busy preparing disaster management plans. And so now they are in the forefront in COVID management, not because they have been treated as agencies, but they have shown over the years of the last 24 years or 25th year we are in, that they have the capacity, especially in the floods. They showed that they can do, they can manage, and that is why they, along with a solid public health system and the state government, are managing COVID-19. Post-COVID capacity building, I feel the issues change. We need to talk about employment. Today we have been talking about that, employment, livelihoods, and many other issues which are going to come up. New roles and responsibilities. The local governments have to actually take up new roles and responsibilities. And it has to be inclusive local governance, especially post-COVID. Yesterday, Dr. Sanal Mohan has been talking about what happens during disasters and COVID-like situation where people are excluded. Marginalized people are excluded. More marginalization takes place. How the local governments can actually address this. And of course, in such situations, they need partners in development and governance, which Professor Turnquist mentioned yesterday. We need to actually work with others. Especially center, state, and local governments have to work together. That was actually a point mentioned in Economic and Political Weekly by our Chief Minister, Mr. Pinarayi Vijayan, mentioning that it is the time when center, state, and local governments on an equal way participate in or work towards post-COVID situation and capacity to do that. That is important. The future has to be redesigned. Future in capacity development also has to be redesigned. A new local government system has to evolve. Then only the Kerala local government system also will continue or sustain. So the pedagogy changes, the tools changes, even talking about training might change. But above all, the ultimate is we need to actually talk about politics of decentralization and local governance, which if we miss, we will collapse today or tomorrow. That is how I take it. So our capacity building efforts, not only in Kerala, anywhere on local governance and decentralization, it's about politics of decentralization, local governance. We need to actually talk about that. We need to focus on that. But I feel we have a promising future. That's what we experienced in the flood situation. That is what we are experiencing in our COVID situation. We had a program called Green Kerala Express, where local governments showed us what they are doing. Now we are having a Saturday program, webinar program on how they are doing now. So which all show that we still have a promising future and we shall overcome. That is what I wanted to conclude with. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. I'm just going to move on here quickly to Dr. Gerson. From agricultural cooperatives to farmer-produced companies, analyzing the transition of cooperativism in India. Go ahead, Dr. Greason.
Thank you, Chair. Respected Chair, co-panelists, and all other delegates and all other participants of this program. And I'll be presenting on a topic from agricultural cooperatives to farmer producer companies, analyzing the transition of cooperativism in India. Despite the surge in urbanization and modernization during the last few decades in India, the country still predominantly remains rural. And according to Census 2011, majority of the rural households, I think about 58%, still depend on agriculture and allied sectors. And these sectors continue to contribute as the principal means of livelihood for the majority of households. And that's why though its contribution to GDP is about 16% only, but it is very significant because it contributes well towards food and nutrition security and also provides primary source of livelihood to a lot of people. A significant segment of population continues to be below poverty line, tackling food security, malnutrition, coupled with poor status in socioeconomic parameters, including Human Development Index. And in a developing country like India, agriculture development requires a higher order of priority. Despite the growth and development in all other fields, it's important to rejuvenate agriculture and allied sectors as they are and shall be important for the future as well. And coming a brief about the cooperative movement. Of course, cooperative movement was born out of adversity across the world, though the circumstances differ from place to place. In USA and Canada, it started as marketing societies, whereas in England as the consumers movement, in France as producer societies, in Germany as rural credit associations, and Italy as labor contract cooperatives. And coming to India, different types of societies that came up in different areas in different periods in the different parts of India. For example, in Maharashtra, it started as sugar cooperatives, whereas in Gujarat as processing societies, whereas in Kerala as land mortgage banks. And we could see a transition of cooperative movement from agricultural cooperatives and to the latest farmer producer companies. And of course, I would like to bring some vital statistics before you. In fact, Census 2011 says, on an average, 2,000 farmers quit farming every day, and mostly from traditional agrarian families. And we could also see a large section of youth in the agrarian families are moving away from agriculture, switching over to other activities which are not even remotely connected with agriculture and allied sectors. And I would like to put it as something like a brain drain in agriculture sector, because we could find several agricultural graduates, they switch over to other professions at the first available opportunity given to them. And we could see a very small segment of youth from the non-agrarian families, they are attracted towards agriculture. Of course, there are some like they take it as a hobby or a part-time engagement and all that, but still it's a very microscopic minority. And of course, there are some interesting points. These statistics, of course, there are some questions for introspection. The statistics which I have quoted and some news are true, even by half. Will it not affect our efforts to achieve and sustain self-reliance and self-sufficiency? Are we sliding down the status from the state of self-reliance and self-sufficiency to a state of dependency in the future? And in this context, whether agricultural cooperatives or the present farmer producer companies or FPCs could play a big role. And if yes, how effectively they are functioning now, it's very, very important to have a quick appraisal about it. And how far whether cooperativism with its thrust on solidarity economics could bring in desirable changes. And shall we read, or is it required to go back to Gandhi, Kumarappa, Vinoba Bhave, Jayaprakash Narayan, and many more thinkers across the world more and try to put their principles into practice? Of course, there are some positive indicators, especially with respect to India. Of course, I would like to put it as a demographic dividend. And the youth in the age group of 15 to 29, as per the National Youth Policy, they comprise about nearly 28% of population. And they contribute towards 34% of the gross national income. And why youth? Because youth form the basis of progress and social mobilization in any country. And aiming at youth development is the most cost-effective strategy for achieving growth and development in a country characterized by demographic dividend. And I would like to just talk a very, very brief about cooperation and cooperativism, because it doesn't be because of paucity of time. And second, it's very difficult to bring out a clear-cut meaning and definition for all these words. But I would like to quote Karl Ratner. Cooperativism is a goal that reaches through successive approximation. And of course, it begins when individuals start to give up their separateness, privacy and self-interest and contribute or integrate their wealth, possession, and rewards to democratically run group in which they collectively decide how the resources will be used to benefit the members together. Group members develop group projects, identify feelings, needs, motives, interests, and responsibilities. This group praxis results in social solidarity and support for the members. It also results in an active role for individual members in shaping the activities of the group, and this affects their behavior. Now, of course, there are several studies on cooperative societies and up to the farmer producer companies. And there is no dearth of studies on cooperatives in India, especially, and of course, also agricultural cooperatives in particular. And though farmer producer companies are in existence in the country since 2002, but of course, there are not much studies carried out. And one of the recent study which I would like to quote is from Asim Premji University on farmer producer companies past, present, and future, which came out only in the month of March 2020. And from the report, I would like to quote a general picture about the FPCs in India. There are about 7,000 plus FPCs are registered as on March 2019, which has about 4.3 million members. And on an average, each FPC has about 582 shareholders. And we could find a 2.6 FPC per 1 lakh farmers in the country. That means almost 1,530 people across for a group of 1 lakh farmers. And among them, almost 92% are farm-based FPCs. And very significant to point out, there is only 3% of the FPCs are with women members. And coming to the spread or extent, almost 50% of the FPCs are in 4 states out of 29 states in the country. And among them, the 25% of FPCs are just available in 20 districts when the whole country has about 600 districts. And the last point in this data is 79% of the farmer producer companies are aged 3 years or less, though the FPCs are in the system for the last 18 years, but almost 4/5 of the FPCs are less than 3 years old. And coming to the COVID-19 and FPCs, I think every crisis has a tendency to bring out the best in the human beings by enabling them to explore meaningful and alternative choices and options. I think that's what we would like to be looking forward. And COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in an unprecedented socio-economic political crisis across the world. And it also resulted in creating a havoc on the human society, exposing their limitations and dogma between idealism and reality on sustainable development practices. And I would like to quote from one of the writings of Dr. Shailendra from IRMA, Ahmedabad. Cooperatives must be enabled to emerge with a new vigor in helping humans to overcome the basic crisis of capitalism, further compounded by COVID-19. I would like to raise some key concerns. We could find less than 7% farmers are only linked with the FPCs in the country. And of course, we could find a truncated spread across the country with about half of the FPCs are limited to 4 states out of 29 states and around 1/4 in 20 districts out of 600 districts in the country. And there is a very limited reach among women, despite the fact that they form majority of the workforce in the field of agriculture and allied sectors. And there is a limited reach among the youth of the country. And there is inadequate financial and professional support available to the people for initiating and stabilizing and sustaining FPCs. And of course, very less thrust on capacity building of the key functionaries of FPCs. And of course, there is a one product, one district. It's a time to rethink how effectively it is happening. I would like to put forward there is a need for some early interventions. There is a need to enhance the reach and extent of FPCs among the Indian farmers in several states of the country, right? Mostly agrarian based like Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Jammu Kashmir, Jharkhand, Haryana, Kerala, Madhya Pradesh, Orissa, Punjab, Rajasthan, Tamil Nadu, Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal, and all northeastern states. And of course, the FPCs need to attract more women and more young people in the country. And there is a need for more farmer-friendly agri ecosystem. As of now, it's not available to the desired extent. And in the context of COVID, I think there is a need to provide or need to have additional financial incentives to the farmers to rejuvenate and also to initiate, to stabilize and to sustain FPCs. And of course, there is a need to incentivize the FPCs with technical guidance and professional backup to ensure their sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I guess we move on to a discussion. We have about 25 minutes here. I don't know quite how we want to approach this because there's a whole bunch of comments on the chat column that are questions that have been directed at various people. With your permission, what I want to do to start off this, I made a note of some things that seem to be asking questions or pointing in the same direction. And maybe if I just put these out there, people can respond to them as they feel they want to. But there was a lot of questions here and a lot of discussion about things like public space, relationship to political parties, relationship of workers to the larger community, links with social movements, and so on and so forth. And there's also been things that have been raised in the discussions about what I would call it, it's my words, but the isolation of cooperatives and how cooperatives sometimes only operate to deal with their members and hope to get a little better deal out of the capitalist system for their members. So I think it'd be useful to have a little discussion about how this can become more widely. How can cooperatives work with communities and community groups and various things to not only oppose capitalism, but start to build an anti-capitalist economic or social movement? So if somebody would like to just pick up on some of those, go ahead. Don't be shy.
If you don't mind, I can start. I think that all these questions are very crucial ones. So what about the connection with communities in space? The question of space goes along. I mean, if we look, it doesn't matter if it's it's more pronounced in the South, but it's also still a question in Europe and other places. So what factories, what occupied workplaces, what workers' takeovers have that poor or workers' communities lack is space. So that's what they also can offer. That's why, like in Argentina, more than 50% of the workers' recuperated workplaces have movements, have social movements, initiatives by the communities and etc. in their factories, in their workplaces, doing things, using this space. The same happens in Europe with 100%, almost 100%, not everyone, but almost all workers' recuperated workplaces. And that can range from libraries to space for local community radios, to simply providing space for evening courses, adult education, parties for children, activities on the weekend, etc. All these things that they can provide. They can cooperate in things like Rimaflow, for example, in Milan, is working together and has supported and has strong ties to a neighborhood group that, starting from the experience from Rimaflow, decided to occupy and recuperate a park that used to be a workers' free time facility and was then like abandoned and closed down by the authorities. They occupied the park and put into shape again the park to be used by working class families. It can be that they offer all kinds of things that whatever can happen. That is not only important for the connection to the community in a sense that who's going to defend the factory, who's going to defend the workplace when it's under attack. how do you build like a connection that people, for example, even yes, they might be a little more expensive, the things, but still less expensive than other organic stuff, but still more expensive than like, let's say, trash food from the grocery store. So how do you have to create this connection also to ensure that you have like a consumer base that understands what you're doing. Rimaflow has, for example, agreements like for they do this lemon liquor, and they have agreements with cooperatives in South Italy that, again, they all have seasonal workers. They're all migrants from Africa mainly, but all these cooperatives have standards that about the treatment, the payment, the living conditions, etc., of the migrant workers. That also means that their fruit is more expensive than the one where you can where owners have the one workers in slavery-like conditions. But also it supports the cooperatives, and in exchange they also resell the oranges that these cooperatives do, like as almost direct producer consumer. During time they built with other places in the whole of Italy a structure that is called Beyond Market, and is selling solidarity economy, cooperative, etc. Products in weekly markets or self community made shops, etc., and tries to organize a direct like consumer producer, or at least as little media intermediaries as possible. But this is also a question of values. So you still probably most of the times earn less working in such a worker recuperated place or cooperatives. So what keeps, I mean, factory jobs or most of these jobs are not nice anyway. It doesn't matter if it's a cooperative. It's nicer in a cooperative, but it's still not that you dream, okay, that's my dream, what I want to do all my life in 60 hours a week or whatever. So you're compensated by money on the capitalist market. If you earn less in a cooperative, in a self-recuperated workplace, you have to have other values that keep you working there. So one is like obviously decision making. One is the thing, what kind of structures, how much is it your own, because you decide with it. But another value is also, and that's something that many people underline, especially like in Venezuela or in experience that also in ex-Yugoslavia or in Italy and etc., is that people recognize them in the neighborhood and say, oh, they're the ones from the factory, they're the workers there. So their pride is also that their job, their economy, what they are doing is serving the community, not the market. It's not serving the economy, it's trying to build a new economy around the capacities. And another element that goes in almost all, and I think it could be like a point maybe for Marcelo, beyond Argentina and Uruguay, where there's less concern about health questions and environmental questions, and it's changing, but there's, I think, coming from a tradition of more modernizing thinking that is there in the Argentinian left and working class. But in all other countries, health issues and sustainability and ecological issues become central issues immediately as soon as the workers take over the factory, because it's their health. I mean, we know that the whole discourse around sustainability, ecology, etc., is built upon like the effect on consumers. But if we really look at it, it's mainly the effect on the workers. But obviously, you can't sell European middle class organic bananas or organic tea telling them that it's better for the workers. They don't care about the workers. They care about their own children and families. So you have to sell them to them and tell them it's about your health. But in fact, it's mainly about the health of the workers. And the workers know that. And that's why they switch in most things, like these issues become central. And the last point I want to touch here is the question about co-ops, class struggle, and conflict. The question of commons is not a question, like Ostrom puts it, to avoid conflict and have harmony. It's a question of conflict. Without conflict, no progress. Without conflict, no class consciousness. With no class consciousness, no class struggle, and no progress in anything. So sustainability of of cooperatives and long-time sustainability, to keep like certain values, to be able to defend yourself against the capitalist market, against threats from all over, is based on conflict, not on harmony. If you base it on harmony, the moment that capital needs your space, it will take it. And it doesn't matter. And we experience it all around the world. And it doesn't matter what kind of commons, what is like so nicely called the Enclosure of Commons, which is like robbery, theft, expropriation, happens as soon as people are not able to defend, to be in a conflict, to have a conflict relationship, and see, even if there is at a certain point kinds of cooperation agreements or whatever, that there is a fundamental antagonism between what communities want, what communities need, what people need, what kind of ecology, what kind of economical system, what kind of work, and everything else almost existing in from the economy to the state and institutions that are modeled along the needs of a capitalist economy and not along the needs of communities, etc. That's why, last sentence, I want to underline that I think it was very important how the comrade from Kerala underlined the agency from below as one of the central incentives of change. Thank you.
Thank you, Dario. Can we try and keep our comments to about 3 or 4 minutes to allow to make a contribution? So is there anybody else who'd like to intervene?
Yeah, I'd like to add some points there. Dara did a great job of outlining it. The first thing is that I just want to underscore how cooperatives come from a militant background, although they haven't become militant. It was part of the class struggle of the 19th century against capitalism, together with unions. It was a way of workers coming together and producers coming together to produce better livelihoods, better products collectively outside of the worst conditions that late adolescent capitalism was offering during the Industrial Revolution. Actually, co-ops precede unions, right? The work of Robert Owen was first about co-ops, and then he helped kind of start the union movements, which were linked really closely to cooperatives. So the centrality of work in working life. In the 20th century, it was co-opted. Cooperativism was co-opted, and it's now become, in many ways, one more way of conducting business. And it took off focus. It took a member focus. So in Italy, they call it mutualism, mutualismo, right? Where cooperatives are mutually beneficial to members. The cooperatives that Dario and I are talking about and that are emerging as a reaction to, in response to the worst effects of neoliberalism, we can call them community cooperatives, social cooperatives. I mean, there's a legal structure to social cooperatives in Italy, started by communities, people in towns, to meet the needs of local people around social welfare and social benefit in the wake of the Italian state shrinking. So social co-ops, now it's an official model in Italy. You can start a social cooperative, but it was started by local people to meet local needs. And now increasingly in Italy, they're talking about community cooperatives, which is Rimaflo is a form, but also this fuori mercato, or out of the market network that it's established, that's bringing together other forms of co-ops. And the last, what I want to say is that what's needed here, crisis opens, it's not just a rupture and a closing, but it's more importantly an opening. Our current moment of crisis is showing this. It's an opening for other possibilities. And I'm quoting many thinkers and practitioners here, so I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. And cooperatives have a place to reorganize the economy. And I'm starting to increasingly think about and write about the role of co-ops in the pandemic and post-pandemic. So what crisis does is it generates consciousness. It transforms a consciousness of workers. Not crisis does. So what happens is workers in Argentina, and I trace this out in my book from the words of the workers themselves, workers changed from employees, managed employees, to self-managed workers. To become a self-managed worker means that your consciousness has to change. You're not just a dependent employee receiving a check and going home. And ironically, the workers that I interviewed told me that this was a burden, right? They didn't see this as a utopia. It was a burden. Now they have to worry about co-managing the business and this and that. But then when I asked him immediately after, would you go back to working for a boss? No. I wouldn't go back to working for a boss, right? So there's a responsibility. There's a freedom, community, coming together, but there's also responsibility when it comes to cooperation and solidarity, right? It's rooted in solidarity, but it's this transformation of consciousness that has to happen. And this is the issue with encouraging the cooperative movement to flourish and become more radical. Consciousness has to change. The consciousness of those involved have to change, and that's why it's still rooted in class. Anyway, those are my brief comments.
Very much. I think that we could have a whole new seminar on the whole question of how we change consciousness.
Yes, indeed.
It's interesting that whenever we have a crisis, whether it's an economic crisis, a pandemic crisis, blah, 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 it goes on and on, an environmental crisis like a hurricane or whatever, people always get together to work together to survive under that situation. How do we transform that to the everyday world that's going on? And not just, as you pointed out, cooperatives preceded trade unions, but cooperatives and trade unions, to a large part, at least in the Western world as I see it, have largely went down the same road. Yeah. And they actually exist to fight an economic battle with capitalism for their members. But then it stops there and we don't go any further. So basically what we're doing is maintaining the capitalist ethos, the idea that more money makes us better, have a better life, et cetera, et cetera. And Dario, you mentioned something about developing values that would replace money, what I would say replace things. Yeah. Like values replace 5 cars or 4 campsites or 15 trips to the south to sit in the sun in the wintertime to escape the reality of nature in our own country. I'll stop there. Anyway, there's no want to say something.
Yeah.
One of the, I just will intervene again, the whole question of COVID. What we have seen consistently around the world is whenever the economies open up, the COVID cases skyrocket. We've seen that. Look at South Korea right now. South Korea had the best, or one of the best records of anywhere in the world. They opened up the economy and now they have a disaster. So we're in a situation where we can't win. Yeah. If we don't open up, the virus is going to devastate the world. If we do open up, capitalism is going to collapse. Now, in my world, I'd rather see capitalism collapse.
But this is because we have, and this is in the history of humanity, the fact that we have linked social well-being and collectivity, collective action, which is a human practice that dates back to whenever we started existing. The fact that we've linked it to an economic system that's run by, that's controlled by those that own the means of production. This is a new development. This is a brand new. We had never organized societies like this before, right? Even in feudal times, those that worked the land still had some autonomy to protect. So this wouldn't have happened. Well, first of all, people didn't migrate as much, right? So they stood in place, but it wouldn't have happened in a system that, capitalism has propagated COVID-19. The other thing at COVID, so it was because of globalization also that the spread has been so quickly, and it's showing that Ricardo was wrong. Comparative advantage is not the way. Globalization in this extreme form has shown that, for example, Canada couldn't produce at the beginning. Canada couldn't produce face masks because it had shipped all face mask production. Where was it buying it from? Wuhan, of all places. That's where most face masks for Canada used to come from, right? We've sold off our local ability to produce things, right? To self-sustain ourselves. So Michael Schumann talks about, rather than comparative advantage, comparative resilience. That the future, so if this plays out in a way that's revolutionary, this COVID crisis, in the future, it will be localities, right? It will be localities, wealth will be located in localities, will be self-sustaining localities, and the new power sources aren't going to be countries, they're going to be localities, municipalities, local areas that can self-sustain themselves. That's where the new power, economic and social power will be, right? Because those will be the ones that will be able to sustain these forms of, what's now a biohazard, a biological issue. Anyway, there's more to say about this, which probably requires another conference.
But it's also important, I think, to note that these local communities that are self-sufficient and self-contained to a certain extent can also be an incredible defense against future pandemics.
Oh, correct. Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. One of the major cases, sorry, I don't want to, but one of the major outbreaks in Canada, and this, again, a critique, COVID-19 is critiquing global capitalism, right? One of the major outbreaks in Canada recently were migrant workers, temporary migrant workers working in farms. Where do they come from? Jamaica, Central America, Mexico. They experienced a massive outbreak a few months ago. Right? I mean,
which raises the question, why are they here in the first place?
Exactly. Yeah.
Anybody else? We have a few minutes here.
Tabu, you want to talk?
Yes.
Then unmute.
I just want to make a point. I have a couple of questions on micro level cooperativism and macro level cooperativism. So I feel that both micro level and macro level cooperative movements are extremely important. What we have seen in Kerala is the micro level, multi-scale, decentralized, inclusive planning that we have seen in Kerala. What Kerala government did is they sort of followed the policy of Korea. They traced the people. When the when people came from Wuhan, they really traced them and put them in the containment zone. So they have effectively done the tracing, testing, and treating, involving the social capital. So this is a fantastic example of a multi-scale, decentralized, inclusive, micro-level planning. Best example. And if you look at Italy, if you look at Spain, the micro-level planning, they really failed. There's a disaster. They didn't do much of planning. And Germany has to really help many of the patients. They had to airlift, many patients from, Spain and Italy, and they had to give them ventilators, financially supported. So the micro-level planning was extremely poor in Spain, in Italy, partly in France too. They really failed. And Kerala government, did fantastic thing in community kitchens. Giving masks and physical distancing. This is basically because of the, I would say, micro level decentralized planning. I think both are very important, both micro and macro level. Macro level is extremely important for vaccine development. Macro level cooperation is extremely important for understanding the disease. Macro level cooperation is very important to design ventilators. If a country is in shortage of ventilators, of course, we need to have international cooperation. So I strongly feel that micro level and macro level cooperation are extremely important to contain this pandemic. Thank you.
I just wanted to underscore how Kerala has been used as one of the examples, one of the lights of the world right now, and coordinating and organizing around around the pandemic. It's one of some astute writers and journalists have actually pointed out not only South Korea initially and Taiwan but also Kerala.
Yes.
So it's
yes.
congratulations to all of
It's a
you.
fantastic example for the micro level, multi-scale, decentralized planning. Fantastic example, Kerala. And the primary health system, Kerala is fantastic.
Yeah.
I won't say that our tertiary health system is good, but the primary healthcare is extremely good in Kerala.
Just a few sentences on the question of Italy and Spain. I mean, the problem generally is that the decentralization in countries with neoliberal policies has been used to decentralize the tasks on a local and regional level, but not the money. So they were left without money. I mean, in Italy, healthcare turned out to be an issue of the regions, of the regions of the federal state. What happened is that the worst cases are in Lombardy, not only because it's an industrial center, and it's the most important, like Northern Italy is the most important region in logistics in the whole of Europe. I mean, we know that there are two corridors, one going from southern Spain, Valencia, to Romania, and the other one from Rotterdam down to the south. And they cross in Italy, in northern Italy, in Lombardy and northern Tuscany. So this is one of the most important centers for logistics. But at this end, it was governed by the right, and they dismantled the healthcare system. And that, like, these two factors together, obviously caused a disaster. And something similar happened in Spain. Yes. So this is the problem. Is like the neoliberal decentralization is a disaster because it's a decentralization of tasks without the decentralization of money and of facilities. So if you don't give people like the finances and everything else to do this, it's obviously gonna turn into a disaster. And I also say, yes, Kerala has been used as an example, and also Cuba. And I think that it points out one thing, because, like, for example, in Europe, one of the poorest countries in Western Europe, Greece, had one of the best results. And I think that there is a correlation, and it had to be studied better, but I think that I don't know about Kerala, what you can say, but definitely about Cuba, there is also a correlation between the self-organization of the population and the ability to counter the pandemic. And that's why, like, Greece is coming from many years of strong experience of mutualism and self-organization. And I think that influenced very much, like, the capacity to handle the pandemic. In Cuba, it's obvious the organization of the population. And I think that in Kerala, probably this is also an important factor. So it's not just about the finances you have at hand, but it's also about, again, the organization of the population.
Additionally, Kerala has also gained experience from containing the Nipah virus, and also the way we tackled the flood. So Kerala also gained a lot of experience that also contributed substantially to contain the coronavirus.
Errol, shall I come in?
Yes.
Joy here. Shall I?
Head.
Okay. So actually, Dario, this is exactly what Dr. Isaac told us on the first day in the inaugural speech, as well as I was mentioning. It's about the politics of decentralization and local governance. If it is in the neoliberal economies, the decentralization is something different, whereas what we do is different. So it is basically the politics of decentralization, local governance, which is important. And that's exactly what has been told here also. How we strengthen our public health system, the primary healthcare system, how do we improve our education system, and all kinds of things are all based on that kind of an approach. And local governance system is also based on that politics. And it is not in a vacuum. I will also take a couple of questions which Dr. Patrick Heller had mentioned. Especially, you had asked me about how the line department personnel come together under the local governments. See, this COVID actually shows us every local level functionary in the department of local government functionaries are working under the leadership of the local government, especially at the ward level under the ward elected members, whether you are from the health department or from the social justice department or any other department, they are all working under the leadership of the ward elected member and the local government system. So that way, local governments have become the convergence point, and under the broad umbrella of that, it functions. So that has been a very positive thing which has happened now. And then the second one is actually about how much devolution, I mean, how much this line department personnel have come in. Of course, as per the departments enlisted, all of them are part of the local government system, except that it is dual control. But things have changed a lot since you came here last. So there is actually a lot of convergence happening, working together and other things. With regard to the extraordinary thing the local governments did during the floods in 2018, see, you know that it was 12 districts out of the 14 which were flooded, and no centralized agency could actually get in. It is only the local people, local government can actually function. Right from announcement that there would be something happening, they were into the field, into the waters, and then it was the management, rescue management, and organization of camps. And later they, in fact, many of these local government leaders came back home seeing that their own houses were flooded and in disaster. Actually, that was the kind of this thing. But main thing difference I would see is actually a paradigm shift and change in the way people consider a rescue camp or a rehabilitation camp. The structure, the facilities, and all those things have changed once the local government took in. They actually went into the sensitive elements of all these people. And also, see, also I would also say that people could actually engage with the local government representatives, even post-flood. See, I actually usually say after that flood, there was another flood. It was actually flood of grievances and complaints, but it all went to the local government representatives and local governments because people considered that as their government. That's exactly what we meant. So people considered that, though officially at that time, local governments were not mandated to do that. There were other agencies, but they found that this is what it is. And at the COVID time also, when we find that, say, for example, Dr. Sabu mentioned about the community kitchen. See, when the government announced that we need to have community kitchens, within 36 hours, the entire state had 1,034 community kitchens functioning, which could not have happened if it was centralized, because you go through all sorts of red tapeism and bureaucratic elements here, and also the community participation, voluntarism, right? In the case of management of camps during the floods, as well as the COVID times, it is because of the local government that the voluntarism actually has got strengthened at that time. That is the point which I wanted to make. There was also one more question I would like to take from Professor Sanal Mohan. Actually, he had actually mentioned a very important thing that is regarding the Dalit Christians, marginalized and disadvantaged people. But in his second part of his question, he had also mentioned that questions of marginality created by the federal state of Kerala, also the government of India. So that exactly is the question, because the local governments function under an overall framework provided by the state and the national government. Still, we had a few initiatives a few years back. We were all part of it, where how these Dalit Christians could be brought into this system, how they could, all those kinds of things, still maintaining. But I can still say that we have a long way to go, not only with regard to Dalit Christians, marginalized sections, the tribals especially. And that is why in my talk, actually, I mentioned about the inclusion issue, because COVID and the post-COVID or any disaster, these are the people who get more marginalized, forgotten sometimes, or more marginalized. And that is where more sensitivity has to come from, or responses have to come from the local government side, which is actually a need, not really, even in Kerala, I would say. So I fully agree with what you said, but there are also limitations the local government face. But one more issue I feel is about the marginalized sections is that we still, even the local governments go by the old system of patronage, of providing something, rather than not on a working on a social mobility issue of bringing them up into the mainstream. That again is another issue where all of us, the social scientists, activists, and all need to actually find a way out. How do we do this with the local governments? But personally, I felt that local governments provides a platform for all of us to intervene, which does not happen with the higher tiers of government. I mean, thank you for that question. It's actually an eye opener for many people around. So this is it. And finally, it is about the politics of decentralization, local governance, which people should understand. The elected representatives, the functionaries, and the state should understand. That is it. Thank you.
Chair, this is Girishan. Can I make two brief comments?
Yes, go ahead.
So though India has a very rich tradition and strong philosophy of cooperation, but somewhere down the line, we have lost the track when in the development paradigm. I think we have moved much away from the writings of Gandhi, Kumarappa, Vinod Bhave, and Jayaprakash Narayan, and many such leaders who strongly advocated for cooperation. I think that's why I made a suggestion that we need to go back and read and try to put whatever is put possible into practice. And I would like to make a last comment. In the post-COVID era, I think the cooperativism with trust on solidarity and social capital will hold the key for development across the world, despite the type of governments in power. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know how much time we have here. We're looking to be about 15 minutes over time. Is there anyone else that would like to make a closing comment? Gopal?
Something. Yes, I thoroughly enjoyed.
Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me?
No. Can anybody else hear you?
No.
There seems to be a problem here with the sound. Try again, Gopal.
So you have to come closer to the mic.
Can you hear me now?
Slightly better.
Yes, but
Slightly
we can
better.
see you.
How is it now? Is it better? Anyway, I enjoyed the discussion between Marcelo and Errol on the question of Ricardo versus what many nations have been opting now. That is, as against the classical thing of comparative advantage vis-a-vis the self-reliance and alternative to managing the disasters or any such long-term problems. I think what recently the government of India has announced is more support to the local institutions, local groups to keep up with their own craftsmanship, their own knowledge, their own interests, and their own needs, all to be matched within the communities, whether it is at the self-help group level or at the municipality level or at the village panchayat level or the village level. That will give the more prominent solution to employment and poverty issues emerging out of COVID. I think this self-reliance concept has to be given a higher upper value as compared to the what you mentioned, the Canada importing masks from Wuhan, and Wuhan one day say good night, no more masks for you, then Canada will be in trouble. I think the theory of the comparative advantage has its own limitation in disaster situations like this one. This is my opinion.
I think that we have to be extremely careful when we're looking at how central governments are supporting local activities. A lot of time they do support local activities, but it is a process where local groups are producing at a very low rate and doing all of the grunt work that the capitalists don't want to do. And I personally am very suspicious of any central government that puts money into local issues without giving the local people control over what's going on.
No, you give them the choice. What retain your own craftsmanship. Do what you want for your own people. Don't think of sitting in your village. Think of a person in, say, in a city like Mumbai or Delhi. For him, you don't produce for him. You produce for yourself.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to just pitch in here with a brief comment? We're pretty well out of time here, I think. Is that right, Joe?
I think, yeah.
I don't know what, we can go forever if we want to, but I'm not sure how the system works.
I would say take 5 more minutes and wind up.
Sorry, Joe?
Take 5 more minutes, say, if needed.
5 minutes. You want to make another comment?
There was a question on, this is Sabutama, there was a question on critical thinking in science. See, you see, universities, what we really adopt is outcome-based education. So we truly teach the students to develop critical thinking process. That is extremely important. So critical thinking has to be developed in science teaching. So this is the answer to Joe's Chapiculam. That is what is outcome-based education. You have to really develop critical thinking process. So we always advocate our teachers, when you give any lessons in science or engineering or mathematics, you have to really inculcate critical thinking. That is extremely important in science education. So they are interrelated. This is one of the main objectives of outcome-based education, develop critical thinking. Dr. Jose, do you have any comments?
I think that that's very true. We have to develop critical thinking.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
That's the theme of the publishing company, critical book for critical thinking. However, I think that critical thinking has to be outside of the parameters that are dictated by the culture of our capitalist system.
Yes.
And if critical system is only within that framework, it doesn't achieve anything.
Yeah, respected chairman, I will post just some clarification from your side. Science per se, whether it enable critical thinking or we need a separate project for critical thinking.
I completely agree with Errol. I mean, one of the main problems is, and I'm now like in the US for like about the last 3 years, and until Occupy, the US has had more Marxists in universities than outside, and it was like an ideal mechanism to isolate them, to give them the playground in the university and enough money to have a good life, and then you don't have them like disturbing outside universities. That's what it looked to me. So the question is also like how, and that's a strong experience from Venezuela, for example, how do activists, also maybe former activists or activists that go into institutions of leftist governments or centrist leftist governments, how do they maintain a critical approach? How don't they get lost in the institutions, accommodated, whatever you want to call it? In Venezuela, people in the neighborhoods, and I lived in the barrios, they started saying at a certain point, they started saying, you want to neutralize a revolutionary, give him an office with air condition. And that's what exactly like what happened in a lot of cases. So that's the same question like that comes also up. How do like cooperatives maintain class consciousness and connections with the struggles? There are like examples like Chilaver that Marcelo also studied in Argentina, for example. They have 1 day a month that is work time, and they dedicate to support other struggles. So every worker 1 day a month has to go physically somewhere to a different factory, to a different worker struggle, and support it with something. They have used their the graphic union they built. Print shops have a long tradition of revolutionary struggles all over the world. The graphic union, there are like 19 different recuperator workshops, print shops in there. They provide active consulting for other print shops and other factories and workers that want to take over and occupy their workplaces. RimaFlow supported a struggle of workers of a cafeteria in a hospital close by that was supposed to be closed and privatized, and they fought against the privatization for a public modernization plan for the cafeteria. They won, And after that, the workers of the cafeteria even were able to impose with the institutions that the whole complete old cafeteria was gifted to Rimaflow, which used it to set up their cafeteria for the lunch for workers. So there are a lot of possibilities, but it's crucial to maintain like the cooperatives in a vision of class struggle and working class, not a new business model. They're not an alternative business model, how it's taught now in Canada, in the US, and unfortunately in a lot of places in Europe too. Maybe just Barcelona, there's a focus on cooperative management in the university. It's a bit different. But otherwise, like it's like, oh, it's an alternative business model. No, it's not. It's part of class struggle. It's what communities did to have a better life and to change society. And the same thing I think applies to academia and to critical studies. That's why it is important also to carry them outside the universities to people that don't have access to university studies, or that simply don't have access for different reasons, or because also you can discuss different things. I mean, I worked for many years in adult education for different leftist foundations and organizations, and I worked also in popular education in Latin America. And I have to say that most of the times I liked that 1,000 times more than being in university, because the first question of these people was not what do I have to do for the exam or how do I get a grade, which is like became one of the most important things in universities, but they came giving their time, giving their money, giving what they had to learn something, to learn something, to make a difference, to make a change. And unfortunately, that's maybe now a bit more again, but less and less the perspective in universities.
It's pretty hard to break down the incredible dominance of the capitalist culture that dominates the way we all think and the way we all see the world. I was just watching the television this morning and watching hundreds of thousands of people in France out demonstrating, wanting to open up the system. And on the next graphic showed that France had more cases of COVID than they've had since somewhere around March. So how do we break down, in our critical thinking and in the university is a kind of an ivory tower where people can critically think forever, but that critical thinking never gets outside the bounds of that university in any effective way. And so what it does is for the university, which is primarily in existence to serve the interest of the capitalist marketplace overall, if critical thinking can happen in the university, it gives the universities a false look at being liberal and open and so on and so forth. But as long as they have no effect on what happens in the wider society, nobody cares. You can critically think all you like.
I just want to say that there's some really critical work emerging around this from Black scholars and their role within the university. I'm thinking of the work of Fred Moten and the Undercommons. And so that there's a whole, there are groups of people, especially in Black scholarship, African Americans and others, that are really putting a lot of thought to this. How can they be in the university and not of it? Right. And in many ways, they have to struggle for alternatives all the time. They have to struggle for other ways and other ways of connecting, right, that are connected to the discriminations that the capitalist system has layered on us.
I would add to that, Mario, at least in Canada, there's a lot of critical thinking and input from Indigenous scholars.
Yeah, absolutely.
Philosophically and in their worldview have a much greater understanding of our relationship to nature and how we have to work with and cooperate with nature. And we see what has happened when we haven't done that. You know, we're not only facing the coronavirus, we're not only facing all kinds of other problems, we're facing a collapse of the world economy, ecology, because we've decided we can take and control nature. We can't do that. We have to learn how to live with it. And that means we have to scale down the way we live. I'll talk a little more about that tomorrow. Okay, how are we doing here for time, Joe?
I think we can wind up. What do you think, Joy Elamon?
Yes,
Are you
yes,
there?
yes, we can wind up. No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just close it.
You can do it.
Okay, see you tomorrow.
Many thanks.
Thank you, everyone, and a good
Bye.
night. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Good morning.
Good morning and good night. Yeah. And tomorrow,
Same time, same
same time.
station.
Yeah. Same time.
Okay.
Okay,
Bye.
Chairman.